I'm Davey, and this is going to be a channel about the history of words, otherwise known as etymology. I just find it interesting to learn where the most words that we use every day actually came from. Often their origins are offensive, often they're funny, often they're just completely unknown, even if they're really common words like dog or girl. The most common words in English language, I bet probably very few of you watching know the origins of. Partly because they're not really related to a lot of other big words. Things like, things that have stems that are shared by scientific words, Latin or Greek words, you might guess the etymology of, but the most basic ones, it's actually harder to. So the 10 most common words in English, in terms of like how often they occur in various corpi, however you say it, are the, be, to, that is to, of, and, in, that, have, and I. And if you think about it, they're very, very familiar, but you probably can't tell me where, why any of them are precisely the sounds that they are. And you might think it just kind of random, but there's actually a history that's known for each one of them. Today I'm going to be talking about the and that and various other words that are related to those. So these words, all these words in the list are Germanic. They go back to when English was first forming in areas of Germany around Jutland, which is the peninsula that Denmark's on today. And three groups of German people lived near that peninsula in northern parts of Germany: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, along with some smaller tribes. And in between like the 5th and maybe the 4th to 6th century AD, those three tribes migrated to England and parts of Scotland in the aftermath of the Roman Empire pulling out of the region and collapsing, or as it was weakening as well. So these groups come into England and they form an identity together. They become the Anglo-Saxons. The Jutes were important too, but they kind of got forgotten, and the Germanic languages of these three groups blend together, and they become what's known as either Old English or Anglo-Saxon. And these people at first in their language didn't have a definite article. The definite article in English today is the, so like when you want to talk about a specific thing, you say the couch as opposed to a couch, right? And some languages like Latin just don't have a definite article like that. You just you just say a word, but you don't put anything before it. We have that with proper nouns, right? You don't need to say, you might say like the Ukraine or the Sudan, but with most countries we'll just say like Spain or Egypt. We don't need to put a the in front of it. And in languages without a definite article, it's like that for all nouns when you want to refer to a specific thing. Anyway, so that's how this early Germanic language, Old English, was at first. But then I'm using all these TH words. These words, it turns out, all have a common origin. All the words I'm saying, they start with the. Yeah. And again, that's another one. They did have what's called a demonstrative pronoun, that, which is it means it fills the same function in English today. When you want to refer to a specific thing without saying the name of that thing, just to indicate that it's a thing that you're talking about, you can say that, right? And they had that word. And they began to use that word more broadly to become a definite article. So if you think about it, right, when you talk about the building, you might as well say that building. It kind of means the same thing, except that tends to imply like that you've specifically you've talked about it before, maybe very recently, maybe it's in physical proximity. Talking about the building is sort of a more abstract, it's less, sort of intense, an explicit way of referring. It's a less intense way to refer to something than referring to it with the demonstrative pronoun that. I could talk about that, that girl versus the girl. That girl suggests you is really important in some conversation. The girl, okay, just some girl, you know who I'm talking about because I said the instead of whatever. Anyway, so that started taking on the role of a definite article. But the thing is, Old English had genders. it had masculine, feminine, and neuter, 3 genders. And as one could argue is happening in our society today, in the 2020s, gender was undergoing, the cultural conception of gender was undergoing a lot of change. Back in the Anglo-Saxon world, when Old English started to turn into Middle English, in around the time of the Norman conquest of England in like the 11th century. And at first, with the 3 genders, that had 3 forms. The masculine form was say, spelled S-E, though of course spelling wasn't even standardized in English until like the 17th or 18th century, maybe a little bit later, so it certainly wasn't standardized back in Anglo-Saxon times. Anyway, the masculine form was say, feminine form was saw, and the neuter form was that. But they wouldn't have spelled it with a TH back then. There was some of that going on, but mostly they would have represented the TH sound with either of 2 letters that we don't use anymore, thorn or F. I don't know, there should be a graphic there describing those. Anyway, they had those, the feminine form was actually seo, so it was say, seo, and that. And over time, the v in the neuter form, that, replaced the S in the other 2 forms. So you ended up with them all starting with and then the masculine form was then they instead of say, but spelled like with a thorn and then an E. And eventually that became our definite article, the. There were also lots of other forms, because English used to have many more rules. If you studied Latin or Greek, you know that there are probably many other languages too, but those are ones I'm somewhat familiar with. There's all kinds of different cases nouns can have. Here we change, in English, if we do need to change pronouns sometimes, depending on where they fall in the sentence. You would say, he gave the ball to him, right? So he is the one who's doing the action, him is the one who's having the action done to him, or he hit him, so we change he to him depending on whether he's the subject of the sentence or the object. But if you're using a normal noun besides a pronoun, it doesn't really matter which spot it goes in, The robot gave the ball to the other robot, okay, it stays the same. So we really don't have a case system anymore in modern English, but there used to be a very complicated case system, so depending on gender and number, that is singularity versus plurality of a noun, and which case you were using, there'll be all kinds of different forms of the original definite article say. But eventually they all kind of collapsed into this one form, the, but not quite, because there were a few other forms you ended up with. If you think about it today, we still say that, and we also still say this. That was another form of that definite article say. In this, in Old English, it was just another conjugation. Well, that's not quite the right word. That's for verbs. Declension of say. But today we use. But today this is thought of as demonstrative like that. But for largely accidental reasons, this is associated with things that are closer. That's associated with things that are far away. But they both just came from different forms of this same word. And those is a little bit of an interesting case. Okay, so sorry, getting ahead of myself. These is just the plural of this. That again is just one of the plural forms of that say word that the and everything else came from. Okay, but those was originally though, and it was though even in modern English, not just Middle English, but modern English, just a couple centuries ago, in some backwoods parts of England, not like London, but certain other parts. So it would have been spelled THO, but eventually, because it's supposed to be plural, they added an S on, either just to make it sound plural in general, or to make it sound like these. So this, these, that, those, but originally it was this, these, that, though. So when you make talk in slang and talk about like that though and spell though THO, you can remember that actually though was originally also a way of saying those. So that slang will be especially confusing to someone from that time period in Middle English and in certain places during the period of Middle English and early modern English into where early modern English is like the 16th or the 15th and 16th centuries. So that's they is another word. The plural or third person plural form. They is another way really of referring to some things. It's kind of the same thing as those, except well, they is associated more with people. If you call some people those, it kind of sounds maybe offensive, especially depending on which people you're talking about, right? You wouldn't say, oh, I don't want them here. Okay, I don't want those here. Well, that sounds bad, right? But anyway, they basically share the same etymology. They come from this, the same demonstrative words, say, again, different conjugations of that. So all these words that start with the turn out to be related. One interesting other point I'll mention is that, and I'll just say they're not all words that start with the are related. Thee and thou, you might know, were the old second person singular pronouns in English. That means if you're referring to one you instead of all y'all, a bunch of yous, then you would say thee and thou. It wasn't originally formal. It was just what you would say to anybody. Thee was the subject form and thou was the object, thou was the subject form, thee was the object form. They start with a the sound too, but that's not related. But lots of other things, as I said, this, these, those, that, the, and also there, is probably, though it's not necessarily confirmed, but there, meaning over there, used to refer to a place, probably started out as like that with a suffix, an R suffix indicating a place somehow. So like there is really like that place. And then and than, it might be hard for some people to remember which one to use in which situation, where they actually both used to essentially be synonyms. If you think about it, when you use than in comparisons, like I am taller than he is, it originally it was sort of supposed to mean the other than. Like I am taller, and now we're going to make a comparison. Then we're going to talk about him. So it's like I am taller than him. It sounds sort of clunky, but that's often how basic words got invented. Before you had this word, you would have, the only reason this word would have been invented is if the language at that time didn't have a good word, for that usage, or for whatever reason people found the words clunky and preferred another word or phrase. And so than really was filling in for having the same meaning as then, basically, in that context. We can also use than, there's, okay, so that's a context we can use than in other contexts, but they're all ultimately the same as then, referring to a specific time or like a specific point that we're discussing. So all these the words are ultimately related, except for the and thous, basically. Not every word that has the sound, but a lot of them. Another thing I'll mention about the sound is that it wasn't actually, you might think that the reason that these really important, function words, as they're called, words that don't have like a lot of specific meaning, but are just used in all kinds of senses to refer to a lot of things. Why these words are used so much, why these words all have that sound, you might think it's because the was a really common sound in Old English. Well, we know they all came from one particular word, and actually, the say and the forms of that word specifically, the declensions. But actually, in Old English, they didn't distinguish between the and th. There's some things like that in English today, like sounds that we treat as basically the same, even though we kind of use one sound in some words and another sound in other words, but that other languages distinguish between. An example could be whether we aspirate a consonant or not, which is like whether you sort of breathe while you're saying it. Like with a P, you can say a P like p, or you can say it like p, and kind of not breathe after it. And in some languages, like, that makes a big difference, and people hear the difference, but we don't really. And today we hear the difference between th and th. That is like the th in the old-fashioned pronoun thy, or old-fashioned possessive pronoun thy, like, know thyself, right? Thy versus the th in thigh. Thigh, the thigh in your leg has a soft th, whereas the possessive pronoun thy has the hard of. So those, we do recognize the difference. But in Old English, they treated them the same. So they could have said th or th in any of these words. When the first came about, they probably would have just, or that was already around in Old English times, as the neuter form of this demonstrative pronoun say. So they would have just said that or that interchangeably. They really didn't recognize the difference. And so they would have spelled either of them with an F or with a thorn too, because they were treated as the same. Another case that was like that apparently is S and Z. They were also treated as the same in Old English. Nowadays, we recognize the difference between the two TH sounds, and we recognize the difference between S and Z, but just as we spell both TH sounds TH today, we spell both S and Z often with an S. As in, at the end of a word, often we could have houses, or we could have, especially if we're talking about verbs, douses, he douses something in oil, or we could talk about a mouse, right? At the end of a word, it's often hard to tell unless you just have heard the word before, or you know the context, or similar words, whether an S is pronounced like S or Z. And that's just like with TH not telling you whether it's pronounced with a soft or hard TH. It goes back to an Old English when they didn't really recognize the difference between the sounds. So it doesn't mean there was like something wrong with them. Like I said, there are sounds that we don't recognize the difference between today. It really just depends on the language. But then the problem is if you spell two sounds the same, then the language evolves so that you start recognizing their different sounds and then pronouncing different words differently, and you keep the same spelling. Well, then the spelling's no longer so clear. So that's one annoying thing about English. It's gone through so many changes. And one last thing I'll say about these different words that came from say, and they're related to the, is that, I will say two things. One thing I'll say is that there's one construction with the in which the is actually a different word, sort of. It still came from that pronoun say in one of its forms, but it didn't come through the same root as all the normal uses of the. And that's the construction we say, like, the more the better, or it was all for the good that he left when he did, things like that. The there comes from probably comes from what's called the instrumental case of that demonstrative pronoun say, meaning that it really meant originally like by that, sort of. So when you say like the more the better, originally people understood it when that expression first came about as saying something like by that moreness we have by that better. Again, with these very basic instructions, it's hard to translate it in a way that doesn't sound clunky, because of course, basic words were different in English before we had our basic words today, so you can't translate it word for word. But the point is that, when you say the more, the better, like, more isn't, when people came up with that expression, they weren't thinking of more as an abstract object like you would, draw on like a flow chart, like more, and there's a box that says more. They weren't thinking about it like that. It really meant just something like, by the fact that we have more, by this we have better, or it was all by this good that he left. So the in those contexts isn't exactly the same it was really another form of that demonstrative pronoun say in Old English. I'll also say that sometimes you see when people are trying to make something look really old-fashioned, they write or they write like ye old liquor store or whatever. Maybe that's not the best example. Ye old saloon. I don't know what they say. Ye old something or other. Spell old O-L-D-E, which I think is a genuine archaic spelling of old, because, like I said, spelling wasn't standardized until the last couple centuries, really. Sometime around like the founding of the US, basically. But when you pronounce it ye, that's actually wrong. That was, in fact, an archaic way of writing the, but it was never pronounced ye. It was pronounced, would have been pronounced they. And that's because the Y there wasn't actually a Y. It was only used because Y looked sort of like that character I've mentioned a couple times, thorn, that could be used to represent the TH sound. And on sometimes some printing presses, or I guess later typewriters, wouldn't have the key for thorn. So they just write a Y, or even just it would be simpler to write a Y maybe than write thorn instead of thorn. But that wasn't to be understood as a Y, it was to be understood as standing in for thorn, to be pronounced as thor, and not y. So they would have still pronounced it the, except vowels have changed a lot in English over the last several centuries, so it wouldn't have been the, it would have been they. The E is pronounced more like A in most Romance languages. That's how it used to be in English too, before the great vowel shift during, I guess, late Middle English, the early modern period, and related things like that. But the main point is the Y would have been pronounced not like a Y. It was representing the letter thorn, not an actual Y. So you should really just say they old instead of ye old in that case. And I'll just say yeah, I think that's that's all I have to say about the and words related to it. Next time I'll talk about some other basic words. Probably the next one is, let's see, which is the next most common word after the. The next most common word is be, which is naturally the most common verb. That would be counting all the different forms of it, I believe, in this list, which is of most common words compiled by the Oxford English Corpus. I assume it's associated with the Oxford English Dictionary. The next most common word is be, so that would include all the different forms of it. Am, is, was, were, etc. And we'll talk about why they all sound so different and where that verb originally came from. Oh, yeah, one more thing I'll add is that this say determiner that led to thee or demonstrative pronoun and those and that and this and there and then and then and all those things, it's related to similar pronouns in other languages. If you know German at all, you know the definite article there. One of them is die, that's spelled like die. Maybe not pronouncing it right, but anyway, that has the same origin naturally. English is a Germanic language. But even farther afield, Greek, you might have heard the expression hoi polloi, meaning like the common people. Well, hoi is the Greek word, or is a Greek word for the, but the more fundamental the, I believe, in Greek is o, and hoi is like some form of that, and that also ultimately shares an origin, even though it doesn't sound anything like say in Proto-Indo-European. So, if you look at very basic function words, you often see root in an origin point in Proto-Indo-European. But you can certainly hear the similarity, hopefully, between D and say. This is sort of similar to the D, and especially the V. They are very similar. Indeed, in Spanish, some European Spanish speakers will pronounce some S's as V's, and then Latin American speakers might pronounce them as just S's. So all these sounds are sort of related, S and D and th, but there are all kinds of complicated rules for how sounds change in languages. But I'll just say that the articles in various European languages are often related. I'm not sure about Romance languages, but at least the Greek article, the German article, the English, those definite articles, those are all related. So next time we'll talk about the verb to be.